This is the Convene podcast. Welcome to another episode of the Convene Talk. My name is Maggie, Digital Media Editor. Today, I wanted us to discuss virtual events inspired by a Fast Company article titled Redefining Engagement, the Future of Conferences in a Digital Age. The author, Duncan Wardle, a former head of innovation and creativity at Disney and currently founder of Ideate and Innovate, is a frequent keynote speaker at events. He shares in the article his experience from the beginning of the pandemic to date and argues virtual events are a great thing that happened to his speaking career, but also that they are a great thing that happened to the industry as well. And while he mentioned that engagement is the current pain point for virtual events, he believes that the fast developing tech will soon help us solve that effectively. He also offers solutions, which I won't go into detail in right now, but we'll link the article so you can read about it. And I just wanted to pass it on to all of you. So what do you think of virtual events right now? Yes or no? And actually, what's your most recent experience at a virtual event? I personally cannot remember the last time I attended a virtual event. So I'm curious to hear your experience. Casey?
Thanks, Maggie. I don't think I can remember my last virtual event either. It might have been CL or EduCon last year, or maybe CL this year. There was some programming. But what this article really reminded me of was, and I thought it was a great article, by the way, but it took me back kind of to 2020 when the Convene team was churning out stories pretty much every day about how planners were pivoting really quickly to digital and trying to find solutions that worked for their speakers and their exhibitors and their attendees. And in particular, it reminded me of ASTRO, which is the American Society for Radiation Oncology, and their annual meeting. At the time in 2020, they decided to call it in May that they were moving their October meeting totally virtual. And they said because they had months of lead time, they were able to really consider the needs of everybody involved and pick a really cool, really immersive experience that allowed people to actually walk virtually through the Miami Beach Convention Center, which is something that is still stuck with me because it was quite innovative at the time. And Miami was where they were supposed to have the meeting. So they really brought the destination into that virtual event. But in talking about this, of course, they said time was really on their side. And of course, this requires a lot of funds and staffing as well, which we know a lot of planners are really struggling with right now. And it's really kind of a luxury. In the Fast Company article, the author said to maximize the effectiveness of virtual conferences, you really need a dedicated technology team to identify what tools you need. And I just think that's such an important point. I would love to see virtual events advance because I do think they'll play an important role in this industry in the future, but people really need the staff to help them. They need the budget to work on it, and they need the time, which I think is really difficult right now too. Jen, what do you think?
Thanks, Casey. So what you said got me thinking about it seems like a lot has changed since we kind of started using this technology more and more back in 2020. And I thought of two experiences that kind of show that. And these aren't I would say, massive steps forward, or it's just kind of tweaks that have been made that really kind of show, that kind of demonstrate what we need out of the experience. And what I'm thinking of, it really wasn't even a full-on event. It was a webinar. It was maybe an hour long-ish. It was actually with Julius Solaris. It was an interview that he did with Time Inc.'s events CEO. And this was a few months ago, and he hosted it on LinkedIn. And I was just so impressed. And it was the first time I'd ever sat in on a virtual event on LinkedIn. And there were a couple of things that stood out to me. that I think show that we've really made some strides in what we want out of this kind of experience. The first was that with the video being on LinkedIn, I could immediately see everyone who was also participating and watching and asking questions. And you could immediately see their profiles and who they were and connect with them and chat with them. And it was such a seamless experience in the LinkedIn platform. I really liked that, and it made it really enjoyable. And I felt like I really got a sense of who these people were. Where on some other platforms, it's kind of hard to figure out who's who, especially if there's a lot of people there. I sat in on another industry event on Zoom recently. While I recognized a few names, or at least, 30, 40, 50 people. So it wasn't as easy to tell where people were from, what their jobs were. Another example that I thought was really interesting that is a little bit different is actually something that Inc. wrote about, and we can throw this link in the notes later so that you can read it. But it's how supporters of Kamala Harris have been using Zoom meetings to raise like a significant amount of money. So this article kind of talks about how this wouldn't really have been possible in 2020 or before that. First, the platform wouldn't have been able to contain the amount of people that have joined these Zoom meetings, which has gotten up to like almost 200,000 participants. And it's also just been really successful as a way to get celebrity supporters to participate, which also helps raise more money. She interviewed a couple experts in this article who talk about, getting a celebrity to an event physically takes a lot more time and money and convincing, whereas, showing up on a Zoom, not so much. So I just thought that was something that was really interesting that, we're seeing a lot more of now that we wouldn't have seen back in 2020. Barbara, what are your thoughts?
Thanks, Jen. My thoughts are kind of like from the big picture. I feel like this article to me seemed to be putting virtual events back on an old template of the conference. And I just think that is going to just kind of be decoupled. And one of the reasons is when he talks about immersion, like there is just nothing that can compare to the immersiveness of real life events. No matter how spectacular something is on screen, the most mundane things in real life can be full of novelty and surprise and just, getting off the airplane and the airport smells like toast is like, you remember that. And I just think that's really hard to replicate on screen, even with all the technology. So I think for immersiveness, it's going to be face to face. And I think the thing that digital is really good for are these short, focused, very purpose oriented to get in a lot of diverse viewpoints, to get in narrowing in on topics. To me, the big gift of digital meetings is the breakout because, those little groups of 4 to 6 or 8 people, that's a way that you can really kind of get to know each other. But I just don't think that at this point, I would love to be proved wrong, but you're just never going to get that collision of ideas. We're not brains behind screens. We're like whole people. And, if you're on a digital event, the person that is designing the event is in total control of your experience in a way that they're not when you're at an online event. You can slip out of an event that you're not interested in and walk to the next event with somebody. And I'm super interested in all the research into what I would call collective intelligence. How, there's so much research about if you're sitting together with other people, you learn in a way that you just don't when you're by yourself. When you walk with people, you just have a different kind of experience than just sitting behind the screen. And I think the last thing I'll say is with so much, so much time spent with people working behind screens. Maybe that's kind of just, people that do the kind of work we do. I think there's a lot of professions that don't sit behind screens that way. But I just think there's this lack of novelty about it that no matter how splashy it gets, it's never going to feel like, walking with somebody and sitting down and feeling the breeze. And so I think that digital will be used for very focused bringing together people and not as a replacement or a true alternative for face-to-face meetings. Michelle, what are you thinking?
I totally agree with you. I think, though, it was written by a speaker, and you could understand why for him this is like a great opportunity because he can present and also, earn his fees without leaving his home, and he doesn't have to fly everywhere. So I immediately understood his perspective was as a speaker. As I think we interviewed somebody else who also during the pandemic said, this is the greatest thing ever. I can talk to these groups from my garden and I don't have to get on an airplane. And it definitely makes a lot of sense in that respect. I think that during the pandemic, it became very clear to people that they could get education and they could hear someone speak virtually, and that worked for them. But to your point, I sort of disagree about those small groups because I think that people then recognized even more what they were missing by not being together face to face. And so I think that's part of what we're working on with the next issue is why networking has taken on greater importance. It used to be like networking and education, the two things that people said were the most important reasons why they went to a conference. Now I think they recognize the education. They can get that online mostly. It's the meeting with people and sharing ideas like you said, Barbara. We used to talk about, isn't it great how people can just have these happenstance, meetings, and this how wonderful it is that it's also. I'm trying to think of the word, like just like it just happens, it's organic, but people are looking for more intentional, I think, opportunities to meet the people they want to meet, because that is why they're going now to events more so than education. In many cases, I'm talking in very broad strokes here, but what I'm interested in seeing with the meetings market survey that we just sent out is if it tracks differently than last year. Because last year we asked the question, do you offer a digital version of all or a portion of your in-person events? And 42% said no, they are just face-to-face. Now they're back completely face-to-face. And I think that speaks to what Casey said is what we've heard anecdotally and also at PCMA is it's a great investment of resources you need in order to have real engagement with a virtual audience. So it's the technology. It's like having two meetings because you have to have people who are just assigned to that, the virtual aspect. But it's a real shame to have lost the gains we made in online during the pandemic because it made it, more inclusive for audiences who can't travel to engage with that community to learn. So it feels like we've kind of lost something, but I'm hopeful that, to Barbara's point, we'll get back to virtual, but not in the way that this speaker talked about, which is replicating a face-to-face experience, but just different digital aspects of events and education and training and, community. So, Curt, what do you think?
What you said about what we asked in the meetings market survey is a good segue into into when I first read this article, I had to go back and look at the date because I thought, wow, this is totally against what everybody's saying, which is online meetings are kind of dead at the moment, and the way this guy was writing it was like, ooh, this is the future. This is what's going to happen all the time. And this is what's happening all the time. And I thought, all right, is this from years ago, or what's going on here? But I'm just going to echo everything everybody's already said, I think, because I love the idea of using online meetings to save the planet, so to speak, because now no one has to fly everywhere, and also to make it more accessible to people and all that kind of stuff. But I love the idea of extending the life of meetings through virtual events that follow afterward. And I think a lot of places maybe don't seize that opportunity, even if it's just, building something out from one of the speakers, and I mean, I'd say make it more than just rewatching the video, but you could do all kinds of great stuff, I think, and just build it out. And some places do it. We've written about some places that make a whole year's worth of education out of that kind of stuff, which is really cool. Or they do smaller meetings. I think like when PCMA does the little labs now, and I think sometimes those could be online. They're smaller groups, and I'm sure they're great in person. I've never been to one, but it seems like that kind of smaller thing could be great online, and especially if it is focused on something that maybe happened at a bigger event, that people were at the bigger event or something like that. But I think there's a place for virtual events, and I think it is kind of sad that as soon as the threat of COVID seemed to be gone, everybody just went rushing back to only in person. And I also wonder, is it just events people and their events for events people, who are really stuck with the we're only going to do it in person stuff, or because their business is bringing people together, right? Or is it like, are all industries feeling that way? Because I think that sometimes we see within just the one little bubble, and we're talking to event planners and everything. But I wonder if other places, if it's not that big a deal, if they don't think, they're not, like Barbara said, they're not always in front of, they're not doing a job where they're always on their screen. So maybe it's not a big deal to have a meeting on a screen or have an event on a screen. So I always wonder about that too.
I think a lot of those decisions that event planners take are actually guided by their clients that come from different industries. I would say it's not only events for event planners, but it's wider, and it's informed by the larger population. While we may not remember, or most of us don't remember, our last virtual conference, I think there's still space for webinars. I mean, now that they're not as many as they used to be during the pandemic, I mean, we had every day, every hour, there was a webinar. It feels that there is now a great space carved out for webinars. I mean, I do enjoy a webinar now and then. They're also not that often. They cover good topics. They seem relevant. So it's nice to be at a webinar instead of waiting for a big conference to actually get something rolled out. And I just want to make a point on what you were saying about immersive experiences. And no matter where you hold your event, if it's in person or virtual, I think the one thing event planners would agree on is it takes a lot of resources to make it engaging. Nowadays, it's just resource heavy. And I think that's why event planners still have to make the pick. They rarely go for a hybrid option, but then they just pour a lot of resources into either. And we were discussing also another article from BizBash that kind of collected favorite ideas from event planners or on ways to engage in person, which was interesting and kind of offering different solutions for immersive experiences. So that was, I mean, for me, the bottom line was you still have to have a lot of planning, a lot of resources, and be very, very thoughtful, which also segues to our next cover story on networking. So stay tuned for that.
I just wanted to bring up a specific example of what Curt was talking about how to kind of extend your content year-round online. Earlier this year, there's a meeting for that. I wrote about the annual Biomedical Research Conference for Minoritized Scientists, which is quite a mouthful. They have a really interesting hybrid event every year, but they don't only rely on that to deliver their content. They have ABR CMS 365, which is sort of a reimagined version of their year-round programming that's free and accessible to anyone who can't participate in their annual event. And they also have an online spring symposium for a certain sector of their members, and then a graduate student symposium. So they found all different ways to really repurpose their content from their annual meeting and give it new life, which I think a lot of organizations can benefit from if they have the resources to do that.
Just going back to the data about how many organizations are still having virtual extensions, I think it would be so interesting to know what kinds of organizations are doing that. I would think that like the science and medical associations where they're sharing knowledge and wanting to really cast the widest net possible would be a place where digital meetings are really valuable. So I don't know if that data will be available. Like, I don't know where to get that data, but I suspect it would be, the places where you go and you're maybe wanting to meet partners or business ideas might be a little different than where you're wanting to share knowledge and also, get to those places that people would not necessarily be in the room or wouldn't be heard if they were in the room. I think digital meetings are great for that.
And just going back to what Curt said, also, it's, I think scientists, we read stories about scientists who don't want to travel, who just think it's so, I think virtual for them is probably more of an appealing option. Sorry, Casey, I didn't mean to speak over you.
Nope, you're good. I was just going to agree with what Barbara was saying. I think it's really dependent on what industry you're in, what's more beneficial. For some meetings, just having a knowledge exchange might be all that you really want to get out of your conference, but there are other industries where that socialization aspect is a key part of doing business. So it depends on the needs of the members of that community.
Yeah, I would agree. Also, for medical, it depends if they're passing on knowledge or a practical skill, because many times they just need to present a new way of doing something, a certain procedure, and they need the hands-on or, work with certain new machines or whatever. So they actually need to see it. And I remember during the pandemic working in a company that organized a lot of medical meetings. That was a huge challenge, how to present that and show that in a way that people would understand it. And they can understand it, but they still miss the feeling, the touch, and like being close by each other and seeing how the hands move and how the more experienced person would actually create that. So I think there's time and place for everything, for sure. And I think that was something during the pandemic that we saw more of. Everybody just going one way and being very convinced about it and not really thinking of the options and just saying, yes, virtual is the future. And then it was, no, hybrid is the future. And then back to, no, it's just in person. I think we need to be a bit more flexible and mindful of who are we serving, why are we serving them, and what are their, right? Why would they dedicate the time to really participate? And with that, I want to thank you all for the discussion, as always. And for our listeners, to remind them to subscribe, comment, share the podcast, send us any questions, or if you want us to address specific topics. And as usual, there will be links in the show notes. And until next time.